The system that runs your life is so familiar you've stopped seeing it. You walked into a school at age 5. Someone handed you a book. A trained teacher stood at the front of the room. You moved up through grade after grade, year after year, following a structure so old and so embedded in American life that it feels like it was always there. Like the roads, like the weather, like something that came with the continent. It didn't. The American public school system was not discovered. It was not inherited. It was not an inevitable product of democracy. It was seized, fought for against ferocious opposition from church leaders, from professional teachers, from state politicians, from parents who believed that public education was one step from tyranny. Every standard your teachers had to meet, every professional certification they earned, every single aspect of the modern American school, somebody bled for it. Somebody threw away a career for it. Somebody sat down and wrote furious letters into the night for it. That somebody was Horace Mann, and this is the story of his war. If history like this makes you feel like you missed something important, subscribe. New stories every week. This one barely scratches the surface. To understand why Horace Mann mattered, you have to understand what America looked like before him, and the picture is not flattering. In the 1830s, there was no such thing as American education. There were schools, thousands of them, scattered across the states like seeds thrown by a drunk farmer, some of them taking root, most of them dying. Every state did whatever it wanted. Every county did whatever the state allowed. Every town did whatever the county ignored. And in most places, what the town actually did was hand the whole problem to individual districts, who handed it to individual families, who handed it to whoever was cheapest and most available.
A report from the Massachusetts legislature in the mid-1830s found that only 1 in 3 school-aged children in the state was actually attending school. Massachusetts, the most educated state in America, the state that had been running some form of public schooling since 1647, since the Puritans were still figuring out how to survive a New England winter. 1 in 3. The teachers were a revelation in themselves. There was no training requirement. None. A young man who had himself barely completed a few months of schooling could walk into a room full of children and declare himself an educator. The teachers in most Massachusetts common schools were barely out of their teens. Seasonal employees who taught when the farms didn't need them, who kept discipline with a birch rod and a temper, who covered whatever subjects they personally remembered from their own spotty schooling. A child's entire education was determined by pure geographic accident. Born in the right neighborhood, near a prosperous town with a rich benefactor, you might get something close to a real education. Born 10 miles the wrong way, you got memorization drills and Bible verses, and a man who couldn't explain what he was teaching. The buildings themselves were a scandal. Crumbling structures with broken windows stuffed with rags. Floors so rough children got splinters through their clothes. No proper books, no maps, no globes, sometimes no blackboard. Students jammed onto slab benches in freezing rooms, breathing the same air, passing the same illnesses, repeating the same verses in a call and response that was mistaken for learning. The church controlled enormous portions of what was left. In Massachusetts, Congregationalism had run public education since the colony's founding, and the idea that a school might teach children without also teaching them specific Protestant doctrine was not just unusual, it was dangerous, threatening, practically immoral. This was the system that shaped the boy from Franklin. Horace Mann was born on the 4th of May, 1796, in Franklin, Massachusetts, a small, hardscrabble farming town in Norfolk County that had the distinction of being the home of the poorest school district, the worst schoolhouse, and the cheapest teachers in a region that was not exactly famous for educational excellence. His family had been in Massachusetts for generations, but generations of history don't pay the rent. The Manns were poor. Thomas Mann, Horace's father, was a farmer. The farm work was relentless, the poverty was constant, and the schooling was almost non-existent. From age 10 to age 15,
Young Horace attended school for no more than 6 or 8 weeks in any single year. The rest of the time was the farm. Planting season, haying, harvest, the eternal machinery of a family that was always one bad season from catastrophe. When he did get to school, what he found there matched what every other Massachusetts child found. A barely trained teacher, rows of children on wooden benches, and a curriculum built almost entirely on memorization. Mann would remember his early schooling in words that still sting. Of all the faculties a child possessed, he said, the memory for words was the only one that was ever appealed to. He wasn't exaggerating. You didn't learn to understand at those schools. You learned to recite. Then the losses started. In 1809, Horace's father died of tuberculosis. He was 13. The farm passed to his older brother Stanley. Each child received a modest sum, roughly the price of a decent horse, and that was the entirety of Thomas Mann's estate. Horace was left to figure out his own future with almost no resources and almost no formal education. A year later came a blow that would change him at a deeper level than grief. His older brother Stephen drowned on a Sunday, swimming in the heat of a summer afternoon, having slipped away from church. And when Stephen was laid to rest, the family's minister, a Calvinist preacher named Nathaniel Emmons, rose and delivered what he considered appropriate comfort to the bereaved. Stephen Mann, the Reverend declared, burns in hell today because he profaned the Lord's day. In the church, Horace's mother heard those words and fainted. She had to be carried out of the building by the congregation, and the boy standing there watching his mother collapse under the weight of a preacher's cruelty decided something in that moment. Something about what religion should and should not be allowed to do to human beings. Something about fear and authority and the damage that can be done by people who believe they have God's permission to be merciless. He never forgot it. He never forgot the sound of his mother's grief hitting the floor of that meeting house. What saved him was books. Franklin happened to have established in his own lifetime the first public library in America, a small lending collection, not much more than a room full of volumes donated by Benjamin Franklin himself, the town's famous namesake. Horace read everything in it. He got other books by braiding straw for the hat factories, trading physical labor for pages. He taught himself at hours when the farm was dark and the rest of the family was sleeping. And by the time he was 20, what he had accumulated in that library and in those stolen hours of candlelight was enough. He found a tutor who could teach him Latin and Greek. He studied for 6 months with the intensity of someone who understands that this particular door might not open twice. And in 1816, Horace Mann walked into Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, older than most of the students, poorer than almost all of them, with symptoms of the same tuberculosis that had killed his father already beginning to shadow his lungs. He enrolled as a sophomore. He cooked his own meals to save money. He studied like a man who had seen what life looked like without education and was not going back there. 3 years later, Horace Mann graduated first in his class, valedictorian. The theme of his commencement address was the progressive advancement of the human race toward dignity and happiness. Everyone in the room thought it was the speech of a talented young man with a bright future. They were right. They just didn't know what that future was going to look like. Mann did what smart, ambitious young men of his era were supposed to do. He read law. He studied at the prestigious Litchfield Law School in Connecticut, the same institution that had trained Aaron Burr and John C. Calhoun. He was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1823. He built a practice in Dedham and was soon good enough that the courts and the merchants and the farmers of Norfolk County all came to him. He was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1827, then to the Senate in 1833. By the mid-1830s, Horace Mann was a rising star of Massachusetts Whig politics, the kind of man that powerful people whispered about when they talked about who might eventually run for governor. Then he fell in love. Charlotte Messer was the daughter of Asa Messer, the president of Brown University, the same man who had presided over Mann's graduation. They married in 1830. She was gentle, intelligent, everything he had imagined a partner could be. And in August of 1832, just 2 years after the wedding, Charlotte was gone. Mann was 36 years old and had now watched the disease take his father and his wife. He left Dedham, left his law practice essentially behind, moved to Boston, and took a room at a boarding house on Beacon Hill, run by a woman named Rebecca Clark, mother of the Unitarian minister James Freeman Clark. It was, by any measure, the right boarding house to be in at the wrong time in his life, because also living there, in the spring of 1833, were Elizabeth and Mary Peabody. You have to understand what the Peabody sisters were. Elizabeth was the older one, a force of intellectual nature who had been running schools since she was a teenager, who had taught for Ralph Waldo Emerson's family, who had befriended William Ellery Channing, the great Unitarian preacher, and who had absorbed more philosophy, theology, and pedagogical theory than most Harvard professors. She had opinions about everything, and shared them constantly and brilliantly. She would later open the most famous intellectual bookstore in Boston, where Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne all gathered and argued and drank tea and changed American literature. Mary was quieter, softer, people said, though that word did her no justice. Mary had been teaching since she was 17. She had run schools, tutored students, studied languages. She spoke French and Italian, and contributed pieces to educational journals. She was thoughtful, where Elizabeth was volcanic. She observed, where Elizabeth proclaimed. And when Horace Mann moved into the boarding house on Beacon Hill, still raw with grief, and still not entirely sure who he was going to be without Charlotte, Mary Peabody noticed him. He took a decade to notice her back. Grief works like that sometimes. Through those years, though, through the boarding house conversations and the intellectual debates and the gradual rebuilding of his public life, the Peabody sisters were part of the scaffolding that held him up. They believed in the same things he believed in, that education was a moral enterprise, that children deserved more than what the broken American system was giving them, that the state had an obligation to its young people that it was catastrophically failing to meet. When friends encouraged Mann to run again for office in 1834, Elizabeth and Mary were among those who pushed him. He won. He became president of the Massachusetts Senate, and in that role, in 1837, he signed into law a bill creating what no American state had yet managed to establish, a state board of education, the first centralized educational authority in the nation's history. Then he did something that astonished everyone who knew him. He applied for the job of secretary. The position was a trap by any political calculation. The Massachusetts Board of Education had almost no enforcement power. It couldn't compel any district to do anything. It had almost no money. It was a bully pulpit and nothing more. Every one of Mann's friends and political allies told him the same thing. This is career suicide. You are a former Senate president. You are on a path to the governorship. Why would you throw all of that away to run a toothless committee with no staff and no authority? Mann's diary entry from the 2nd of July, 1837, is one of the most remarkable things any American reformer ever wrote. He had just accepted the position. He was 41 years old and walking away from everything the previous 15 years had built. And he wrote, "My law books are for sale. My office is to let. The bar is no longer my forum. My jurisdiction has changed. I have abandoned jurisprudence and betaken myself to the larger sphere of mind and morals. Mind and morals. Not politics, not power, not career." The man everyone expected to run for governor had decided to spend the rest of his working life fixing an education system that most people thought was fine. He started by going to see it himself. Over the next several years, Mann traveled Massachusetts with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. More than 1,000 schools in more than 300 districts. He walked into every type of community. wealthy coastal towns, factory mill towns, rural farming settlements, immigrant neighborhoods in the cities. He took notes. He interviewed teachers and students and parents and local school committee members. He wrote everything down. What he found confirmed everything he had suspected and was worse in the details. The teachers were a particular heartbreak. Not because they were bad people, most of them weren't, but because they had been set up to fail. A young man who had barely completed his own education, hired because he was available and willing to work cheaply, trying to manage a room of 50 children across 5 different age groups with no curriculum, no support, no training, and no tools beyond a primer and a birch rod. A woman in a one-room schoolhouse. Women were beginning to enter the profession in larger numbers, paid at roughly half the wage of male teachers, trying to teach reading and arithmetic and geography and history and moral formation all at once to children who ranged in age from 5 to 15, in a building where the wind came through the walls. Mann launched the Common School Journal in 1838, bi-weekly. He wrote most of it himself. He covered everything: school architecture, teaching methods, curriculum, teacher training, the economics of education, the philosophical case for public schooling. He was sending it to every teacher in Massachusetts who would read it, building an audience one subscription at a time, making the case in plain language that the common school had to become something better than it was. He laid out his vision in 6 propositions. The public could no longer remain ignorant and free at the same time. A democracy without educated citizens would not stay a democracy for long. Such education had to be paid for by the public through taxation. It had to be open to every child regardless of class, religion, or background. It had to be free of sectarian religious control. The state had no business using public schools to promote any particular church's doctrine. It had to be taught with methods that respected the dignity of children rather than terrorizing them into submission. And it had to be delivered by teachers who had actually been trained for the job. That last point was the one that started the first real war. The idea of a normal school, an institution specifically dedicated to training teachers, was not new. Prussia had been running them for decades. France had adopted them. But in America, in the 1830s, the concept was genuinely radical. It implied several things that powerful people found deeply threatening. It implied that teaching was a profession that required expertise, which was an insult to the thousands of people currently doing it without expertise. It implied that the state had the right to set standards for who could stand in a classroom, which was a direct challenge to the local control that school committees had exercised for 200 years. And it implied that women could and should be trained as professional educators, which was a whole separate controversy nobody was quite ready for. Mann fought for it anyway. He pushed the Massachusetts legislature. He wrote about it constantly in the Common School Journal. He gave speeches. He lobbied. He argued. And in 1839, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts opened the first publicly funded normal school in American history, in a small, rented space in Lexington. The first class was a handful of young women in a rented room in a town of a few thousand people. That was the entire birth of professional teacher training in the United States of America. The man Mann chose to run it was a remarkable educator named Cyrus Pierce, a deeply principled teacher who believed, as Mann did, that the whole point of a school was to awaken a child's intelligence, not suppress it. Pierce threw himself into the work with everything he had, teaching the students by modeling good teaching for them, asking them to do what he did rather than simply to absorb what he said. The school grew slowly, but it grew. And alongside Mann through all of this, contributing lessons to the Common School Journal, gathering support among the intellectual networks of Boston, translating Mann's sometimes combative arguments into language that could reach skeptics, was Mary Peabody. She had been his close friend for 6 years by the time the first normal school opened. She understood his work better than almost anyone. Her sister Elizabeth ran the most important intellectual bookstore in New England, the West Street Bookshop, where William Ellery Channing and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller all gathered to argue and read and think. The entire transcendentalist movement in American literature had its informal headquarters in Elizabeth Peabody's store, and Mary was always there, listening, thinking, writing, believing. Mann still hadn't told her how he felt. The grief for Charlotte was still real. The work consumed him. The resistance was mounting from every direction, from the church, from conservative politicians, from the Boston schoolmasters who saw his reforms as an attack on their profession, from the taxpayers who didn't see why they should fund schools for other people's children. Mann was fighting on 6 fronts simultaneously, running on 4 hours of sleep and moral conviction, and the occasional reminder that somebody had to do this. And then, in the spring of 1843, after 10 years of friendship and almost no sleep, and an education reform movement he had somehow kept alive through sheer force of will, Horace Mann finally asked Mary Peabody to be his wife. She said yes. On the 1st of May, 1843, Horace Mann and Mary Peabody were married in the apartment above Elizabeth Peabody's West Street bookstore. The ceremony was small. The room was probably still faintly smelling of books, and by the end of the afternoon, the new Mr. and Mrs. Mann had boarded the steamship Britannia at the docks in Boston and were headed for Europe. It was the strangest honeymoon in American history, but it had to be this way, because Mann had a mission. He had been authorized by the Massachusetts Board of Education to study foreign school systems and report back. He had been nursing tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his father, the one that had trailed him since his brown years, and the European sea voyage was partly meant to give his lungs some relief. And he had a question burning in him that he couldn't answer from Massachusetts. Somewhere in the world, was someone doing this right? They crossed the Atlantic with 2 other people, Samuel Gridley Howe, the celebrated humanitarian who ran the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston, and his new wife, Julia Ward, who would, 18 years later, sit down in a Washington hotel room and write the words to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The 4 of them traveled as a unit, the double honeymoon couple of Boston progressive reform, sailing toward whatever Europe was going to show them. Mann was thorough. He visited schools in England, Scotland, and Ireland. He crossed to Hamburg and then moved through the German states, Berlin, Potsdam, Halle, Leipzig, Dresden, Weimar. He visited schools in Saxony and the Rhine provinces. He went to Holland and Belgium, and finally to Paris. In England, he sought out Charles Dickens, the author of Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, the most famous chronicler of what poverty and cruelty did to children. And Dickens took Mann on a tour of London's worst slums. The poverty was worse than anything Mann had seen in Massachusetts. The English schools were a disappointment. Recitation and Anglican dogma, teachers standing rigid at the front of the room, children repeating verses without comprehension. But Prussia. In Prussia, Horace Mann walked into classrooms and saw something he had never seen in America. Children who wanted to be there. The Prussian schools operated on a principle that seemed obvious once you saw it, and impossible to explain to someone who hadn't. Teachers were trained, genuinely trained, not just minimally literate. They had studied teaching methods at dedicated institutions, the same kind of normal schools Mann had been fighting to establish in Massachusetts. They taught through questions and conversation rather than dictation and recitation. They understood that learning required engagement, not just obedience. There was no birch rod. There was no cruelty. Children moved through graded classrooms in an orderly progression that matched their development. They were curious. They were awake. Mann watched a Prussian teacher lead a class in geography, and what he saw was a kind of dialogue. The teacher asking questions, the students thinking, the ideas moving back and forth across the room like a living thing. He thought of the Massachusetts classrooms he had visited, of the children jammed onto slab benches, of the memory for words as the only faculty ever appealed to. And he understood standing in that Prussian schoolroom, the size of what he had been fighting for. He began writing his 7th annual report to the Massachusetts Board of Education on the voyage home across the Atlantic.
Mary was with him, reading drafts, catching errors, reminding him when his prose tipped from passion into polemic. He wrote for weeks. The report described what he had seen in Prussia in detail and without apology. It praised Prussian methods. It implied, more than implied, that Massachusetts teachers could learn something from them. The Britannia docked in November of 1843. Mann carried his finished report off the ship, filed it with the board, and waited for the response. He did not have to wait long. The Boston schoolmasters had been watching Horace Mann for 6 years. They had read the Common School Journal. They had heard the lectures about teacher training and curriculum reform and the iniquity of the birch rod. They had endured the normal schools being established and the public celebrations when Mann held teachers' conventions across the state, and they had been angry. Quietly, professionally angry. The kind of anger that looks like patience right up until it looks like war. The 7th annual report was the provocation they had been waiting for. 31 of them, the masters of the Boston public schools, the most established, most respected, most professionally credentialed teachers in the state, assembled their grievances into a document 144 pages long and published it in the spring of 1844. They called it, quote, 2. The name was clinical. The contents were not. Mann, they charged, had insulted American teachers by holding up the Prussian model as superior. He had misunderstood what he saw abroad, seeing Prussian order without comprehending the Prussian authoritarianism that produced it. He had attacked existing American methods without understanding why those methods existed. He had promoted a system of education derived from a foreign monarchy and wanted to impose it on the free people of a republic. He had no credentials as an educator. He was a lawyer, a politician, and had no right to lecture working teachers about how to do a job he had never done. 144 pages, signed by 31 names, published and distributed to newspapers across Massachusetts and beyond. Mann read every word, and then he sat down to write his reply. He could have ignored them. That was an option. The 31 Boston schoolmasters were angry and credentialed and loud, but the Massachusetts Board of Education had no obligation to respond to a pamphlet. Mann could have waited them out, let the noise fade, kept doing the work. That was the politically safe thing to do. Horace Mann had not spent 11 years doing the politically safe thing. He spent the summer of 1844 writing his reply. Not a quick rebuttal, not a dismissive 2-page response. 176 pages, longer than the original attack. Systematic, precise, and at moments almost surgically devastating. He went through the schoolmaster's document argument by argument, taking each one seriously, examining the evidence, and then dismantling it. On the question of credentials, Mann pointed out that he had visited over 1,000 Massachusetts classrooms himself. He had spent 11 years collecting data on every school in the state. He had traveled across Europe specifically to study foreign educational systems. If that did not constitute expertise sufficient to comment on the state of American schools, he asked, what exactly would? On the question of Prussian tyranny, this was the schoolmaster's most emotionally potent argument. Prussia was a monarchy. Its schools were organized to produce obedient subjects, not free citizens. To adopt Prussian methods in American schools was to plant the seeds of authoritarianism in the Republic's own classrooms. Mann took this argument apart with particular care because it was, in a narrow sense, the most interesting one. He had never said, copy Prussia wholesale. He had said, look at what Prussia does about teacher training. Look at how Prussian teachers engage students through dialogue instead of drilling them with recitation. Look at the absence of physical punishment. Look at the curiosity these children display. These specific things did not require a monarchy to produce. They required trained teachers and a different understanding of what a child's mind actually was. And then there was physical punishment, the birch rod,
the familiar weapon of American classroom discipline. On this, Mann was blunt and unapologetic. He had seen what classrooms looked like without it. They did not descend into chaos. They functioned better. Children who were not terrorized into submission turned out to learn more effectively than children who were. This was not a political opinion. It was an observable fact, and he had observed it. The schoolmasters eventually published a rejoinder. Then, Mann answered the rejoinder. The pamphlet war stretched through 1844 and into 1845, generating such a volume of argument and counterargument that someone later bound the full collection, 7 separate documents, into a single volume. One of those 7 documents bore a title that told you everything you needed to know about how the debate had gone. The schoolmasters, bruised and running out of new arguments, called their final document, quote, 3. They wrote that about themselves. It was an admission that they had lost, not just the argument, but the public debate. The newspapers that had covered the fight from the beginning largely sided with Mann. The reading public of Massachusetts, who had been following the Common School Journal for 6 years by now, knew who this man was and what he stood for. The schoolmasters had the prestige of their professional position. Mann had the entire moral argument, backed by 11 years of evidence, and he was a better writer than all 31 of them combined. But winning the schoolmasters was only one battle. There was another front opening simultaneously, and this one was potentially more dangerous, because it was being waged by people who believed, with absolute conviction, that God was on their side. The religious war over public education had been building since the moment Mann had first suggested that Massachusetts schools should not be instruments of any particular church's doctrine. His position was, in his own estimation, quite careful. Faith had nothing to fear from him personally. He was a Unitarian, a branch of Christianity that emphasized reason and moral development over creed and dogma. He believed children should encounter the Bible in school. He believed moral education was essential. What he did not believe was that the state had any business using public money to teach one denomination's specific theology to children whose families worshipped in a different tradition. This seemed to Mann like common sense. Massachusetts was not a religious monoculture. There were Unitarians and Congregationalists and Methodists and Baptists and Quakers, and increasingly, large numbers of Irish Catholic immigrants who had no interest whatsoever in sending their children to schools where Protestant theology was baked into the daily curriculum. A public school system funded by all taxpayers had to serve all taxpayers. It could not be the property of one sect. To the Orthodox Congregationalists of Massachusetts, this was heresy. Not metaphorically, literally. These were people whose ancestors had founded their colony on the principle that education and religious instruction were inseparable, that the whole point of teaching a child to read was so the child could read the Bible. The 17th-century old Deluder Satan Act had said it plainly. Ignorance was the devil's weapon, and the schools existed to defeat it with Scripture. To take theology out of the schools was to hand the schools to Satan. Edward Newton, an influential Massachusetts politician and board member, attacked Mann directly in print. The editor of the Christian Witness, the leading Orthodox Congregationalist newspaper in New England, joined in. The charges were sweeping. Mann was promoting atheism in the schools. He was destroying the moral fabric of Massachusetts. He was a Unitarian trying to impose Unitarian theology on everyone else under the cover of neutrality. Mann's reply ran to 3 letters, later collected in a pamphlet called __quote _for __, and it was as precise and as relentless as his answer to the schoolmasters. He was not removing religion from the schools, he wrote. He was removing sectarianism. The difference was everything. A school that taught children the ethical principles common across Christianity, honesty, kindness, responsibility, the golden rule, was a moral institution. A school that taught children that the Calvinist doctrine of predestination was true and the Unitarian doctrine of free will was heresy was a sectarian institution. The first had a place in a public school. The second did not. The state had no authority to decide theological questions, and the moment it tried, it would inevitably use the majority's beliefs to crush the minorities. That was not education. That was coercion with a textbook. The Catholic Irish immigrants of Boston were not Mann's natural allies. His Protestant assumptions were real, and the Catholic community had its own fierce objections to a school system built around the King James Bible. Their response to the common school movement would ultimately be the creation of a parallel Catholic parochial school system. Even within that conflict, however, Mann's fundamental principle held. A state that tried to use public schools to enforce any particular theology would always, eventually, turn that power against someone. The religious critics never stopped entirely. They were still writing angry pamphlets about Mann's education policy when he stepped down as secretary in 1848. None of it stopped what he was building. Because revenue for public education in Massachusetts had roughly doubled over Mann's 12 years as secretary. The minimum school year, which had been as short as a few months in some districts, was extended and enforced. Teacher salaries, while still inadequate, had risen. The school buildings, while still often inadequate, were being replaced and repaired at a rate that would have been unimaginable in 1837. Libraries were being established in schools across the state. Mann had pushed for this relentlessly, remembering the Franklin Town Library that had educated him when no school could, and the normal schools. By 1848, Mann had built a network of them, several institutions specifically dedicated to training teachers that had not existed a decade before, that still barely existed anywhere else in the United States, that were already producing something that American education had never reliably had before. Teachers who understood what they were doing. The normal schools also did something no one had quite anticipated. They opened professional careers to women, at a scale and with a legitimacy that the existing patchwork system had never offered. Mann had always believed women were exceptionally suited for teaching young children. His thinking on why had some paternalistic edges that belonged to his era, but the practical effect was transformative. The normal schools gave women a path to a professional credential, a professional salary, even if that salary was still less than men received, and a professional identity as educators. The women who trained at the Lexington Normal School and its successors would fan out across Massachusetts and eventually across the country, carrying Mann's methods into classrooms that had never known anything but a birch rod and a recitation primer. What made Mary Peabody Mann's contributions so hard to see from the outside was precisely that it didn't look like what we normally call power. Mann's letters during the worst years of the pamphlet wars show a man who was angry in all directions simultaneously. At the schoolmasters, at the clergy, at the politicians, at the sheer scale of the resistance. He was not always tactically wise about where to direct that anger. Mary was. She knew which allies were drifting and needed to be brought back in. She knew which opponents were genuinely persuadable and which ones just needed to be publicly beaten. She wrote letters that Mann never could have written, the kind that left the recipient feeling heard rather than demolished. And she wrote them constantly, in the margins of everything else she was doing. The campaign for public education in Massachusetts was, in its human texture, as much her work as his. The public statue is his. The record is different. When the 12 years were over and Mann prepared to leave the Board of Education for Congress, what he had created had already begun to replicate itself. Other states were watching Massachusetts. Reformers in New York, Connecticut, Ohio, and Michigan had been corresponding with Mann for years, asking how he had done it, what arguments had worked, what compromises had been necessary. The Massachusetts model, the state board, the normal schools, the standardized curriculum, the extended school year, the trained teachers, was becoming the template not because Massachusetts had mandated anything, but because it worked. The children who came out of the reformed Massachusetts system were measurably better educated than those who had come through the old one. The evidence was accumulating. The resistance was not going away, but it was losing ground. In September of 1848, John Quincy Adams, former President of the United States, current Congressman from Massachusetts, and the most. But the world had its own priorities, and in the 1850s, the world's priority was the question that would eventually consume everything. What was going to be done about slavery? Mann took the position that John Quincy Adams would have taken, because it was the only position a person of his convictions could take. He was ferociously anti-slavery. He opposed the Compromise of 1850. He attacked the Fugitive Slave Act with a fury that made even some of his Whig allies uncomfortable. The act required Northern citizens to actively participate in the capture and return of escaped slaves, and Mann called it on the floor of the House a law that made every man in Massachusetts complicit in bondage. Caution was not his mode on this subject. He was angry. He had spent 12 years arguing that every child deserved a dignified education, that the mind was not a vessel for oppression, but a living thing that required cultivation and respect. The existence of slavery was the direct refutation of everything he had built his life on. He served 2 terms in the House. He ran for governor of Massachusetts in 1852 and lost. And then, as if the universe had decided he needed one final project, one last impossible institution to build from nothing, he accepted the presidency of Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Antioch was brand new. It had been founded on principles that were, in the early 1850s, genuinely revolutionary. Coeducation, meaning men and women would study together in the same classrooms. Non-sectarianism, meaning no church would control it. And equal opportunity for African American students, meaning Black Americans would be admitted and educated on the same terms as white ones. In practice, this meant Antioch was starting with almost no money, almost no buildings, and almost no students in a small Ohio town, with a mission that a substantial portion of its potential donors found politically threatening, and a substantial portion of its potential students had never imagined was possible for them. Mann was in his late 50s, in fragile health. He moved to Yellow Springs anyway. She packed her books, her languages, and whatever remained of their household, and followed him west. The years at Antioch were hard, in a way that the Massachusetts years had not been. The battles with the schoolmasters and the clergy had been brutal, but they had been conducted from a position of at least some institutional authority. Mann had a title, a platform, a budget of sorts, and the weight of the Massachusetts establishment behind the project, if not always in front of it. At Antioch, he had none of that. The college was chronically broke. Faculty went unpaid for months at a stretch. Buildings started and then stopped as money ran out. Students worked whatever jobs they could find to stay enrolled. There were times when it was genuinely unclear whether the college would survive the semester. Mann taught courses in political economy and philosophy. He ran faculty meetings. He handled the endless financial crises. He wrote desperate letters to donors who had promised money and not delivered it. He got sick. He recovered. He got sick again. The tuberculosis that had shadowed him since Brown University was taking him slowly, the way it had taken his father before him. Mary ran the college alongside him. Officially, she was the president's wife. Unofficially, she was the first dean of women Antioch ever had, the person who managed the female students' concerns, who kept the social and academic life of the institution running, who wrote to anxious parents and calmed frantic students, and held the human fabric of the place together when the institutional fabric was fraying. They had 3 sons by then, Horace Jr., George, and Benjamin. The boys grew up on the Antioch campus, in the middle of this ongoing experiment in what education could be. Young Horace had inherited his father's tuberculosis along with his name. George would become a high school principal. Benjamin would become a professor at the Smithsonian. The Mann children were, in a sense, the living proof of everything their parents had argued, that education was transformational, that it mattered what kind of school a child went to, that the institutions a society built for its young people were the truest measure of what that society believed about human potential. In 1859, Antioch College was forced to reorganize under new management. The financial pressures had finally become unsurvivable. Mann had known it was coming. He had fought it for months, calling in every favor, writing every letter, making every argument. It wasn't enough. He was 63 years old, exhausted, his lungs failing. The college's commencement ceremony that summer was his last. He stood at the podium in Yellow Springs, Ohio, in front of the graduating class he had taught and recruited and kept in school through years of crisis. And he spoke for the last time about what he believed the purpose of a human life was. "Be ashamed to die," he told them, "until you have won some victory for humanity." 2 months later, on the 2nd of August, 1859, Horace Mann died in Yellow Springs. Mary was with him. She was always with him. She would survive him by nearly 30 years. She moved back to Massachusetts, settled in Concord, opened another school. She wrote his biography, gathering his letters and journals and annual reports into a 5-volume collection that preserved his arguments for the generations that came after. She translated a Spanish political novel by a reformer named Domingo Sarmiento, who had visited Mann in Boston years before and gone home to eventually become president of Argentina, recruiting New England women to teach in Argentine schools along the way. She published a guide to kindergarten education with her sister Elizabeth. She wrote about women's suffrage. She was, until the end, exactly what she had been from the beginning, a person who believed that education was the most important work a human being could do, and that no institution was so established it couldn't be made better. In the decades after Mann's death, the system he had built in Massachusetts was copied across the country in exactly the way he had hoped. State boards of education proliferated. Normal schools became teachers' colleges, became schools of education. Standardized curriculum, extended school years, professional certification for teachers, local tax funding, graded classrooms organized by age, all of it. The entire architecture of the American public school as you have known it your whole life descended from the work that began in a rented room in Lexington in 1839. Most states in the Union adopted versions of the Massachusetts model. More than 50 public schools across the country are named after Horace Mann.
His statue stands in front of the Massachusetts State House, bronze and permanent, next to Daniel Webster's. When Japan opened to the Western world in the 1850s, the imperial government sent officials to Massachusetts specifically to study the schools Mann had built. The Japanese revered him so completely that there is a statue of Horace Mann in Tokyo. The man who grew up in the worst school district in the poorest town in Massachusetts, who buried his father and his brother and his first wife before he was 40, who walked away from a Senate presidency and a probable governorship to run a powerless committee with no money and no staff, who fought 31 schoolmasters and the Orthodox clergy and half the state legislature simultaneously and kept winning. That man built the institution you walked into at age 5 and never thought twice about. You never thought twice about it because it worked, because it was there, because somebody made it so normal that it felt inevitable. It was not inevitable. There is a version of American history in which Horace Mann takes the governorship, plays the long game, accumulates power the way politicians are supposed to, carefully, patiently, never throwing anything away on a cause that might fail. In that version, the Massachusetts schools limp along for another generation, half-starved and untrained and church-controlled, while the children of the poor memorize Bible verses and the children of the wealthy go to private academies where someone actually teaches them to think. That version of history is not that different from the one we narrowly avoided. The next time someone tells you that institutions don't change, that the way things are is the way they have to be, that the forces aligned against reform are too powerful, that reasonable people accept the world as they find it, think about a boy in a church in Franklin, Massachusetts, watching his mother collapse on the floor while a preacher condemned his dead brother to hell. Think about what that boy decided in that moment, about what authority was,
and wasn't entitled to do to human beings. He spent the rest of his life on that decision. And every child who ever sat in a classroom and learned something real, not memorized it, but actually understood it, felt it move in them, carried it out the door and into their life, is part of what he was reaching for on the morning he wrote, "My law books are for sale. My jurisdiction has changed." He chose mind and morals, and the country he left behind was better for it.